Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones society has forgotten. Sometimes the person sleeping on a park bench once commanded warships. Sometimes the homeless woman you walk past without a second glance has secrets that could shake the very foundations of military power. This is the story of Admiral Richardson's biggest mistake, the day he chose to humiliate someone whose past was far more deadly than he could ever imagine. What happened next would expose corruption at the highest levels and prove that even the most powerful men can fall when they underestimate the wrong person. This is a story about justice, redemption, and the price of arrogance. This is the story of how a forgotten hero brought down an empire of lies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Admiral James Richardson stepped out of his black sedan, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete with the precision of a man accustomed to absolute authority. At 58, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had never been told no, his chest heavy with ribbons and medals that told the story of a career built more on politics than actual combat experience. The gold braids on his uniform caught the light as he straightened his jacket, preparing for another day of commanding respect he felt was his birthright. Richardson had built his reputation on being tough, uncompromising, and utterly intolerant of anything that didn't meet his exacting standards. Under his command, the base ran like clockwork, every sailor knowing their place, every protocol followed to the letter. He took pride in maintaining what he called military excellence, though those who served under him knew it was more about fear than respect. His cold grey eyes missed nothing, and his sharp tongue had reduced seasoned officers to stammering subordinates more times than anyone cared to count. As he walked toward the main administrative building, Richardson's attention was drawn to a disturbance near the base's front gate. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a homeless person who had somehow made it past the initial security checkpoint. The woman was disheveled, her clothes worn and dirty, her graying hair tangled and unkempt. She was arguing with two military police officers who were clearly trying to remove her from the premises without causing a scene. Richardson's jaw tightened. Security breaches were unacceptable, especially on his watch. The fact that a vagrant had managed to get this far onto a military installation was an embarrassment that would reflect poorly on his command. He changed direction and strode purposefully toward the commotion, his face darkening with each step. The woman appeared to be in her early 50s, though the hard life of the streets had aged her beyond her years. Her face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent too many nights sleeping rough. But there was something in her posture, something in the way she held herself, that seemed oddly familiar to Richardson, though he couldn't place it. She was speaking to the MPs in a calm, measured tone that contrasted sharply with her appearance. "I need to speak with Admiral Richardson," she was saying as he approached. "Tell him Commander Sarah Chen is here to see him." Richardson's blood pressure spiked. Not only had this vagrant somehow infiltrated his base, but now she had the audacity to claim military rank and demand to see him personally. The sheer disrespect was staggering. He quickened his pace, his face flushing red with indignation. "What exactly is going on here?" Richardson's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, causing both MPs to snap to attention. The homeless woman turned to face him, and for a brief moment something flickered in her eyes that made Richardson pause. But the moment passed, and his anger surged forward again. "Sir, this individual claims to be military personnel and is demanding to see you," Sergeant Martinez reported, his voice professionally neutral but tinged with obvious skepticism. "She refuses to leave the premises voluntarily." Richardson looked the woman up and down with undisguised contempt. Her clothes were faded and torn, her shoes held together with duct tape, and she carried a worn backpack that appeared to contain all her worldly possessions. The idea that this pathetic creature could ever have been part of his beloved Navy was so absurd it was almost laughable. "Commander Chen," Richardson's voice dripped with sarcasm, "is that what you're calling yourself today?" He took a step closer, his voice rising. "Let me tell you something, lady. Real military officers don't look like street trash. Real commanders don't sleep in doorways and beg for spare change. Whatever game you're playing, whatever sob story you're trying to sell, I'm not buying it." The woman's face remained impassive, but Richardson noticed her hands clench slightly at her sides. "Admiral Richardson, I served under Captain Morrison on the USS Steadfast. I was the executive officer during Operation Silent Storm. I need 5 minutes of your time to discuss something that affects national security." Richardson's laughter was harsh and mocking. "Operation Silent Storm? You've been watching too many movies, sweetheart." The USS Steadfast? Never heard of it. And even if such a ship existed, do you really think they'd put someone like you in command of anything more dangerous than a shopping cart? Several other personnel had stopped to watch the confrontation, and Richardson played to his audience. He was known for his sharp wit and devastating put-downs, and he wasn't about to let this opportunity pass. Look at yourself, he continued, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. You're a disgrace. You're everything that's wrong with society today. People who expect handouts, who lie and cheat and steal their way through life, who show up at the gates of honorable institutions like this one and expect to be taken seriously. The woman's voice remained steady. Sir, I'm not here for charity. I'm here because lives are at stake. If you'll just check my service record. Service record? Richardson's voice rose to near shouting. You want me to waste my time checking fairy tales? You want my staff to humor your delusions? Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. You are not a commander. You are not military personnel. You are a lying, pathetic vagrant who somehow stumbled onto my base, and you're about to be removed with extreme prejudice. The crowd had grown larger, and Richardson noticed several junior officers watching with obvious discomfort. Good, he thought. Let them see what happens to people who try to make fools of their superiors. Let them understand that respect for the chain of command meant everything. Sergeant Martinez, Richardson barked. I want this individual escorted off the base immediately. If she resists, arrest her for trespassing on federal property. And next time, do your job better. I don't want to see how a vagrant made it past the front gate in the first place. As the MPs moved to take her arms, the woman spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. Admiral, before you make the biggest mistake of your career, you might want to know that I have documentation regarding the Blackwater incident. I know about the missing funds, the falsified reports, and the cover-up that's been protecting certain high-ranking officers for the past 3 years. Richardson's face went white. The Blackwater incident was classified at the highest levels, known only to a handful of people with top-secret clearance. The very fact that this woman knew about it was impossible unless... But no, it couldn't be. He studied her face more carefully, trying to see past the grime and the wear of street life. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. And I don't appreciate implications and threats from unstable individuals. The woman reached into her backpack, moving slowly and deliberately so as not to alarm the MPs. She pulled out a sealed plastic bag containing what appeared to be official documents. These are copies of the real reports from Operation Blackwater, the ones that were never submitted, the ones that show exactly how $47 million in Defense Department funds disappeared and who was responsible for covering it up. Richardson's world tilted on its axis. Operation Blackwater was his deepest, darkest secret, the mission that had gone sideways 3 years ago, resulting in massive financial losses that had been covered up through a complex web of falsified paperwork and bureaucratic maneuvering. Only 5 people in the entire military knew the full truth about what had happened, and Richardson had been certain that all of them were either loyal to him or had too much to lose by speaking out. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice cracked slightly. Those documents don't exist. The woman's smile was cold and knowing. Admiral, my name is Sarah Chen, and 3 years ago I was the commanding officer of the USS Steadfast during Operation Blackwater. I was the one who filed the real reports. I was the one who tried to expose the corruption and the cover-up. And I was the one who ended up court-martialed on trumped-up charges, stripped of rank, and discharged dishonorably when I refused to keep my mouth shut about what really happened. The color drained from Richardson's face completely. Suddenly, the woman's bearing made sense. Suddenly, her calm confidence in the face of his abuse seemed less like delusion and more like the composure of someone who had faced down enemy fire and lived to tell about it. Sarah Chen. He remembered the name now, remembered the briefings, remembered the decision to destroy her career to protect the secret. That's impossible, he whispered. Sarah Chen is dead. She died in a car accident 6 months after her discharge. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, though I'll admit there were times when I wished they weren't. Do you know what it's like, Admiral, to go from commanding a warship to sleeping in homeless shelters? Do you know what it's like to have your entire identity stripped away because you refused to lie for corrupt officers? The crowd around them had grown silent. sensing the shift in dynamics but not understanding what was happening. Richardson's mind raced, trying to calculate the implications. If Sarah Chen was alive, if she had the real documents, if she could prove what had really happened during Operation Blackwater, then everything he had worked for, everything he had built would come crashing down around him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "There were reasons. National security reasons. The operation had to remain classified. Certain sacrifices had to be made for the greater good." Sarah's eyes hardened. "Sacrifices? Is that what you call stealing $47 million in taxpayer money? Is that what you call covering up the deaths of 6 sailors because your precious operation was based on flawed intelligence and criminal negligence? Is that what you call destroying the life of the officer who tried to do the right thing?" Richardson looked around desperately. Too many people were listening. Too many witnesses to what was quickly becoming a disaster for his career and reputation. He needed to regain control of the situation. Needed to find a way to neutralize this threat before it destroyed everything. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority, "arrest this woman immediately. She's making terrorist threats against military personnel." But Sarah was ready for this move. "Before you do that, Sergeant, you might want to know that copies of all these documents have been sent to the Inspector General's office, the Secretary of the Navy, and 3 major news outlets. If anything happens to me, if I disappear or have an accident, those documents will be released immediately." Richardson's face twisted with rage and desperation. "You're lying. You're a homeless vagrant with mental problems. No one will believe you. No one will take the word of a street person over that of a decorated admiral." Sarah's smile was cold and dangerous. "Maybe not. But they'll believe the word of Admiral Patricia Morrison, my former commanding officer, who's been looking for me for 3 years. They'll believe the testimony of Lieutenant Commander David Park, who was my operations officer, and kept his own copies of the real reports. They'll believe the forensic accounting that will show exactly where those $47 million went and whose accounts they ended up in." The weight of her words hit Richardson like a physical blow. Admiral Morrison was one of the most respected officers in the Navy, her integrity beyond question. If Morrison was involved, if she was backing Sarah's story, then the game was over. Richardson's career, his reputation, his freedom, everything hung in the balance. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked around at the crowd of onlookers, at the MPs who were still waiting for orders, at the junior officers who were starting to understand that they were witnessing something much bigger than a simple security incident. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the silent assembly. "I want justice, Admiral Richardson. I want the truth to come out about Operation Blackwater. I want the families of those 6 dead sailors to know that their sons and daughters didn't die because of equipment failure or enemy action, but because of criminal negligence and corruption at the highest levels. And I want you to answer for what you've done." Richardson's mind raced through his options. He could have her arrested, but her threat about the documents seemed credible. He could try to discredit her, but with Admiral Morrison potentially backing her story, that would be nearly impossible. He could try to cut a deal, but he knew that Sarah Chen wasn't here for money or personal gain. She was here for revenge, and revenge was something that couldn't be negotiated away. As he stood there in the morning sun, surrounded by his subordinates and facing down the woman whose life he had destroyed, Admiral James Richardson began to understand that his world was about to change forever. The homeless vagrant he had mocked and dismissed just minutes earlier was about to bring down everything he had spent his career building, and the most terrifying part was that he was beginning to realize she had every right to do it. The tension in the air was so thick it could have been cut with a knife as Admiral Richardson stared at the woman who had just turned his world upside down. Sarah Chen stood motionless, her weathered hands still gripping the plastic bag containing the documents that could destroy him. The crowd of military personnel had grown larger, drawn by the commotion, though none of them fully understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Richardson's mind raced through 3 years of carefully constructed lies, fabricated reports, and buried evidence. Operation Blackwater had been his ticket to the top, a classified mission that was supposed to showcase his strategic brilliance and secure his promotion to Fleet Admiral. Instead, it had become his greatest nightmare, a web of corruption and cover-ups that he thought he had successfully buried, along with anyone who could expose the truth. "You're making a very serious mistake," Richardson said, his voice low and threatening. Whatever you think you know about classified operations, whatever documents you think you have, you're dealing with matters of national security that are far beyond your understanding. Sarah's laugh was hollow and bitter. National security? Is that what you told yourself when you ordered us to ignore intelligence reports that showed the mission was compromised? Is that what you told yourself when you sent my ship into a trap because you were too arrogant to admit you were wrong? The memories came flooding back, unbidden and unwanted. Richardson remembered the briefing room 3 years ago. The map spread across the table, the intelligence reports that had seemed too good to be true. Operation Blackwater was supposed to be a simple interdiction mission. Intercept a cargo ship carrying weapons to terrorist organizations, seize the contraband and make a public relations victory out of it. But the intelligence had been flawed from the beginning, based on information from sources that couldn't be verified and analysis that had been rushed to meet political deadlines. The mission was legitimate, Richardson said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. We acted on the best available intelligence. No one could have predicted that the cargo ship was actually a decoy, Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. No one could have predicted that we were being led into an ambush. Admiral, I sent you 3 separate reports detailing inconsistencies in the intelligence. I recommended postponing the mission until we could verify the information. You ignored every single warning because you were so desperate for a victory that you didn't care about the risks to my crew. Richardson's face flushed red. You were always too cautious, Chen. That's why you never made it beyond commander. Real leaders have to be willing to take calculated risks. Calculated risks? Sarah's voice cracked with emotion for the first time. 6 of my sailors died because of your calculated risks. Petty Officer Martinez was 22 years old. Seaman Rodriguez had just gotten married. Lieutenant Williams was 3 weeks away from going home to meet his newborn daughter. They died because you sent us into a suicide mission based on intelligence that a first-year academy student could have seen was compromised. The crowd around them had grown completely silent, hanging on every word. Several junior officers exchanged glances, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a random confrontation with a homeless person. Sergeant Martinez, the MP who had initially tried to remove Sarah from the base, was staring at her with growing recognition and respect. Richardson could see the situation spiraling out of control. Too many people were listening, too many witnesses to what was supposed to be a buried secret. He needed to regain control, needed to shut this down before it went any further. But Sarah Chen wasn't done. She had waited 3 years for this moment, and she wasn't going to be silenced again. After the mission went bad, Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. After my ship was nearly sunk and 6 good sailors were dead, you ordered me to file a report claiming equipment failure. You wanted me to lie about what really happened, to cover up the fact that the intelligence was worthless and the mission was doomed from the start. Richardson's jaw tightened. The details of the mission were classified. The real reasons had to be protected for ongoing operations. You were asked to file a standard operational report, nothing more. A standard operational report? Sarah pulled one of the documents from the plastic bag, holding it up for everyone to see. This is the report you wanted me to file. It claims that the USS Steadfast suffered catastrophic engine failure during routine patrol operations, resulting in the deaths of 6 crew members. It makes no mention of the mission, the ambush, or the fact that we were betrayed by our own intelligence sources. She pulled out another document, this one noticeably different in format and content. And this is the report I actually filed. The one that details exactly what happened during Operation Blackwater, including the compromised intelligence, the inadequate mission planning, and the criminal negligence that led to the deaths of 6 American sailors. Richardson's hands trembled slightly as he recognized the documents. He had been certain that all copies of Sarah's real report had been destroyed, buried so deep in the classified archives that they would never see the light of day. The fact that she still had copies was a catastrophe beyond his worst nightmares. Those documents are classified, he said desperately. Possessing them is a federal crime. Sharing them with unauthorized personnel is treason. Sarah's smile was cold and knowing. I was the commanding officer of the mission, Admiral. I had not only the right but the duty to file an accurate report. The only crime here was your attempt to suppress the truth and destroy anyone who tried to expose it. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. Richardson could see junior officers pulling out their phones, recording the confrontation. In the age of social media and instant communication, he knew that this conversation would be shared with the world within minutes. His carefully constructed reputation was crumbling in real time. "Let me tell you what happened after I filed that real report," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "Within 48 hours, I was relieved of command and confined to quarters pending investigation. Within a week, I was facing charges of insubordination, conduct unbecoming an officer, and mishandling of classified materials. Within a month, I was court-martialed and discharged dishonorably from the service I had devoted my life to." Richardson remembered the court-martial, remembered the closed sessions and the classified testimonies that had ensured Sarah's conviction. It had been a masterful piece of legal maneuvering, using the very classification system that was supposed to protect national secrets to instead protect the careers of corrupt officers. "The court-martial was conducted according to military law," Richardson said weakly. "You were found guilty by a jury of your peers." "A jury of my peers?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "A jury of officers who had been handpicked for their loyalty to the system and their willingness to protect the careers of senior leadership. A jury that was never allowed to see the real evidence, never allowed to hear the testimonies that would have proven my innocence. A jury that was told that national security required them to trust the word of their superiors over the evidence of their own eyes." She pulled out another set of documents, these ones bearing official seals and signatures. "These are the transcripts from my court-martial, Admiral. The real transcripts, not the sanitized versions that were released to the public. They show exactly how the proceedings were manipulated, how evidence was suppressed, and how witnesses were intimidated into changing their testimonies." Richardson's face went pale as he recognized some of the names on the transcripts. Officers who had been present during Operation Blackwater, sailors who had witnessed the events firsthand, analysts who had questioned the validity of the intelligence, all of them had been silenced or discredited to protect the official narrative. "After my discharge," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I tried to find work in the civilian sector, but somehow, every potential employer received calls warning them that I was a security risk, that I was unstable, that hiring me would be a mistake. I lost job after job, apartment after apartment, relationship after relationship. Within 6 months, I was living on the streets, branded as a traitor by the very system I had served faithfully for 20 years. The crowd around them was growing restless, the junior officers clearly disturbed by what they were hearing. Richardson could see the doubt in their eyes, the questions about the system they served and the leaders they followed. This was exactly the kind of reaction he had feared, the reason why Sarah Chen had to be silenced all those years ago. "You brought that on yourself," Richardson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You chose to challenge the system instead of working within it. You chose to put your own sense of righteousness above the greater good of the service." "The greater good?" Sarah's voice rose to nearly a shout. 6 dead sailors, Admiral. $47 million in taxpayer money stolen and hidden in offshore accounts. An entire intelligence network compromised because you were too proud to admit that your precious mission was based on lies. That's your definition of the greater good? Richardson's mind raced, trying to find a way to discredit her, to turn the situation around. But every word she spoke rang with the authority of someone who had lived through the events she was describing. Every document she produced bore the official seals and signatures that proved its authenticity. He was trapped, caught in the web of lies he had spent 3 years weaving. "The money was never stolen," he said desperately. "Operational funds were redirected for legitimate purposes. The accounting irregularities were the result of classification requirements, nothing more." Sarah pulled out a thick folder, its contents clearly organized and indexed. "This is a forensic accounting report prepared by a former Defense Department auditor. It traces every dollar of the $47 million that disappeared after Operation Blackwater. $23 million went to a shell company owned by your brother-in-law. $15 million was used to purchase real estate under your wife's maiden name. The remaining $9 million was distributed among various accounts controlled by the other officers involved in the cover-up." Richardson's knees nearly buckled. The forensic report was his death sentence, proof positive of the corruption that had funded his lifestyle and secured his position. He had been so careful, so certain that the complex web of financial transactions would never be traced back to him. The fact that Sarah had managed to obtain such detailed evidence meant that someone with serious resources and expertise was backing her. "Those are forgeries," he said weakly. "Fabricated evidence created by someone with a grudge against the military." "Are they?" Sarah's smile was triumphant. Then I'm sure you won't mind when the FBI Financial Crimes Unit reviews them. I'm sure you'll have no problem explaining how a Navy admiral making $150,000 a year managed to acquire assets worth over $3 million. The weight of her words hit Richardson like a physical blow. The FBI investigation would uncover everything: the bribes, the kickbacks, the shell companies, the offshore accounts. His career would be over, his reputation destroyed, his freedom forfeit. And it was all because he had underestimated the homeless woman standing before him.
"What do you want?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper.
Sarah looked around at the crowd of military personnel who had gathered to watch the confrontation. Young faces full of idealism and dedication to service. Officers who had joined the Navy to protect their country and serve something greater than themselves. These were the people who deserved the truth, who deserved leaders they could trust and respect. "I want you to tell them," she said, pointing to the assembled crowd. "I want you to tell these sailors the truth about Operation Blackwater. I want you to explain to them how their leaders stole millions of dollars while good people died for lies. I want you to show them that accountability still means something in the United States Navy." Richardson looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing the doubt and disgust beginning to form in their expressions. His authority, his reputation, his entire identity was crumbling before their eyes. He had spent his career demanding respect and obedience from these people, but now he could see that respect turning to contempt. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting harsh shadows across the naval base as Admiral Richardson faced the most important decision of his life. He could continue to lie, continue to deny the evidence that Sarah Chen had laid before him, but he could see in her eyes that she was prepared for that response, that she had planned for every contingency. The woman he had dismissed as a pathetic vagrant just minutes earlier was proving to be the most dangerous opponent he had ever faced. And the most terrifying part was that she was absolutely, unquestionably right. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity as Admiral Richardson stared at Sarah Chen, the weight of 3 years of lies and corruption pressing down on him like a physical force. The crowd of military personnel had grown to nearly 50 people, drawn by word spreading rapidly through the base that something extraordinary was happening near the front gate. Cell phones were out, recording every moment, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved for posterity. Richardson's mind drifted back to the beginning, to the events that had set everything in motion. He remembered the pressure he had been under 3 years ago, the political climate that had demanded quick victories and decisive action. The Defense Department had been under scrutiny for cost overruns and failed operations, and there had been whispers that heads were going to roll if something didn't change soon. Operation Blackwater had seemed like the perfect opportunity to silence the critics and secure his position. Sarah Chen had been the perfect officer to lead the mission, experienced, competent, and completely dedicated to the service. Her record was spotless, her crew loyal, and her ship one of the most advanced in the fleet. On paper, everything about Operation Blackwater had looked like a guaranteed success, but Richardson had been so focused on the potential glory that he had ignored the warning signs, dismissed the concerns raised by his intelligence officers, and pushed forward with a plan that was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. "Tell me about the intelligence," Sarah said, her voice cutting through his reverie. "Tell them where it really came from." Richardson's stomach lurched. The intelligence had been the weakest part of the operation from the start, but he had been under such pressure to act that he had convinced himself it was reliable. The source had been a low-level informant with a history of providing questionable information, but the details he had provided about the weapons shipment had been so specific, so compelling, that Richardson had wanted desperately to believe them. "The intelligence was verified through multiple sources," Richardson said, but even he could hear how unconvincing he sounded. Standard protocols were followed. Sarah pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of Naval Intelligence. "This is the actual intelligence assessment from Operation Blackwater. It clearly states that the primary source was considered unreliable, that the information could not be corroborated through independent channels, and that the mission should be delayed until better intelligence could be obtained." She held up the document so the crowd could see it, though most of them were too far away to read the details. The report recommends a minimum 2-week delay to allow for additional surveillance and verification. It warns that proceeding with the mission based on the available intelligence would constitute an unacceptable risk to personnel and equipment. Richardson felt the blood drain from his face. That report had been classified at the highest levels, buried so deep in the intelligence archives that he had been certain it would never surface. The fact that Sarah had obtained a copy meant that someone inside the intelligence community was backing her, someone with access to the most sensitive materials. The intelligence community has protocols for dealing with time-sensitive operations, he said weakly. Sometimes decisions have to be made with incomplete information. Time-sensitive? Sarah's voice rose with indignation. The only thing that was time-sensitive was your promotion ceremony. You wanted Operation Blackwater completed before the promotion board met so you could claim credit for a major victory. You were willing to risk the lives of my crew for a better spot on your service record. The accusation hit too close to home, and Richardson could see from the expressions of the surrounding personnel that they understood the implications. Military leadership was supposed to be about service and sacrifice, about putting the welfare of subordinates above personal ambition. The idea that an admiral would risk lives for career advancement was a betrayal of everything the service stood for. That's not true, Richardson protested. The timing of the mission was based on operational requirements, nothing more. Sarah reached into her bag again, this time pulling out what appeared to be a personal calendar. This is your calendar from 3 years ago, Admiral, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request after your promotion. It shows the promotion board meeting scheduled for 2 weeks after Operation Blackwater. It shows multiple meetings with political advisors discussing the public relations value of a successful interdiction mission. And it shows a reminder to yourself to make sure Blackwater happens before the board meets. Richardson's legs nearly gave out. The calendar was damning evidence of his true motivations, proof that he had prioritized personal advancement over the safety of his personnel. He had been so arrogant, so confident that his secrets would never be exposed, that he had left a paper trail of his corruption and negligence. Personal calendars taken out of context can be misleading, he said desperately. The timing considerations were about maximizing operational effectiveness. Sarah's laugh was cold and bitter. Operational effectiveness? Let me tell you about operational effectiveness, Admiral. Let me tell you what happened when my ship reached the coordinates you gave us. Her voice took on a distant quality, as if she was reliving the event she was describing. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to hear something significant. I arrived at the target area at 0300 hours, just as planned. The cargo ship was exactly where the intelligence said it would be, which should have been our first warning. Real smugglers don't follow predictable schedules, but we were following orders, so we approached the vessel and prepared to board. Richardson remembered the initial reports from the mission, the brief communications that had suggested everything was proceeding normally. He had been in the command center, surrounded by staff officers and communications equipment, waiting for news of the successful interdiction that would secure his promotion. The boarding party was led by Lieutenant Williams, one of my best officers, Sarah continued. He took 8 sailors with him, all volunteers, all good people who trusted their commanders to send them into situations based on solid intelligence and careful planning. They approached the cargo ship in 2 small boats, ready to secure the vessel and search for the weapons. Her voice cracked slightly, and Richardson could see tears forming in her eyes despite her efforts to maintain composure. The cargo ship was empty, Admiral. No weapons, no smugglers, no contraband of any kind. It was a decoy, exactly as I had warned you it might be. But by the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Richardson wanted to stop her, wanted to prevent her from revealing the full truth about what had happened that night. But he was powerless to interrupt. The momentum had shifted completely to Sarah, and all he could do was listen as she exposed his greatest shame to the world. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger despite the emotion behind it. Fast attack boats, probably modified civilian craft, armed with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. They had been waiting for us, positioned to catch us in a crossfire when we approached the decoy vessel. Richardson closed his eyes, remembering the frantic communications from the USS Steadfast as the situation deteriorated rapidly. The calm, professional voice of Commander Sarah Chen reporting enemy contact, requesting immediate support, fighting desperately to save her ship and crew against overwhelming odds. We fought back, of course, Sarah continued. My crew performed magnificently under impossible circumstances. But we were outnumbered and outgunned, caught in a trap that could have been avoided if anyone had listened to the intelligence warnings. The boarding party was completely exposed. caught between the hostile vessels with nowhere to take cover. She paused, wiping tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. Lieutenant Williams was the first to die. A rocket-propelled grenade hit his boat directly, killing him and 3 of his sailors instantly. The second boat tried to return to the ship, but they were caught in the crossfire. Petty Officer Martinez and Seaman Rodriguez died trying to help their wounded shipmates. By the time we fought our way out of the ambush, 6 of my sailors were dead, and a dozen more were wounded. The silence that followed was deafening. Richardson could see the shock and horror on the faces of the personnel surrounding them, could see the dawning realization of what had really happened during the classified mission they had only heard rumors about. But that wasn't the end of it, Sarah said, her voice hardening again. After we limped back to port with our dead and wounded, after I had to write letters to 6 families explaining how their loved ones had died, you ordered me to file a false report. You wanted me to lie about how they died, to cover up the fact that they had been sent into a trap based on worthless intelligence. Richardson felt the weight of every eye upon him, felt the crushing pressure of the truth finally being exposed after 3 years of carefully constructed lies. The classified nature of the mission required certain adjustments to the official record, he said weakly. Adjustments? Sarah's voice rose to a near shout. You wanted me to tell the families that their sons and husbands and fathers had died in an equipment failure. You wanted me to rob them of the truth about their sacrifice, to prevent them from understanding that their loved ones had died as heroes fighting against impossible odds. The crowd around them was growing restless, the junior officers clearly disturbed by what they were hearing. Richardson could see smartphones being pulled out, social media posts being composed, news outlets being contacted. Within hours, the story would be spreading across the internet, shared and reshared, until it reached millions of people around the world. The families received full military honors, Richardson said desperately. They were told their loved ones died in service to their country. That's what mattered. What mattered was the truth, Sarah replied. What mattered was accountability. What mattered was ensuring that the mistakes that led to their deaths were acknowledged and corrected so that other families wouldn't have to suffer the same loss. She pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense. This is the casualty report that was filed for the 6 sailors who died during Operation Blackwater. It lists the cause of death as equipment failure during routine operations. It makes no mention of enemy action, no mention of the heroic actions they took while under fire, no mention of the fact that they died fighting for their country. Richardson recognized the document, remembered signing it himself as part of the cover-up. At the time, it had seemed like a necessary compromise, a way to protect the classified details of the mission while still providing closure to the families. Now, seeing it through Sarah's eyes, he understood how hollow and dishonest it really was. The families deserved better, Sarah said, her voice cracking with emotion. They deserved to know that their sons and daughters died as heroes, fighting against enemy forces in defense of their shipmates and their mission. Instead, they were told that their loved ones died because of a mechanical failure, a random accident that could have happened to anyone. The weight of her words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Richardson could see the disgust and disappointment in their faces, could see his authority and respect evaporating in real time. These were good people. Dedicated officers and sailors who had joined the service to make a difference, to serve something greater than themselves. The revelation that their leadership was capable of such dishonesty and callousness was a betrayal of everything they believed in. But the worst part, Sarah continued, wasn't the false reports or the cover-up or even the destruction of my career. The worst part was watching you profit from their deaths. Richardson's blood ran cold. He knew what was coming next. Knew that Sarah was about to expose the financial corruption that had followed the operational disaster. This was the moment he had been dreading, the revelation that would destroy not just his career, but his freedom. Tell them about the money, Admiral, Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet. Tell them how you turned the deaths of 6 American sailors into a personal profit opportunity. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the naval base as Admiral Richardson felt the full weight of his crimes bearing down upon him. The crowd had swollen to over 100 people now, with personnel streaming from every corner of the base to witness what was becoming the most dramatic confrontation in the installation's history. Word was spreading through social media faster than Richardson could have imagined, with hashtags like #Operation Blackwater and #Navy Corruption already trending on multiple platforms. Sarah Chen stood before him like an avenging angel, her weathered face set with grim determination as she prepared to expose the final, most damning aspect of Richardson's corruption. The plastic bag containing the document seemed to glow in the sunlight, each piece of paper representing another nail in the coffin of his career and reputation. "The money trail begins immediately after Operation Blackwater," Sarah said, pulling out a thick folder that appeared to contain hundreds of pages of financial records. Within 48 hours of the mission's failure, requisitions were filed for emergency replacement equipment. $47 million was allocated for new weapons systems, communications equipment, and ship repairs that were supposedly needed as a result of the engagement. Richardson's mouth went dry. The emergency requisitions had been his idea, a way to recoup the financial losses from the failed mission while simultaneously creating opportunities for personal profit. At the time, it had seemed like a brilliant solution. Use the tragedy to justify massive spending increases, then skim money from the inflated contracts through a network of shell companies and kickback schemes. "The problem," Sarah continued, "is that the USS Steadfast didn't actually need $47 million worth of new equipment. The damage from the engagement was relatively minor, mostly superficial hull damage and some electronics that were damaged by shrapnel. The total cost of legitimate repairs was less than $3 million. She held up a document bearing the official seal of the Navy's shipyard repair facility. "This is the actual damage assessment conducted by naval engineers immediately after the ship returned to port. It details every piece of equipment that was damaged and provides cost estimates for repairs. The total comes to $2.8 million. Richardson felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The damage assessment had been classified and buried, replaced by a fabricated report that justified the massive spending increases. The fact that Sarah had obtained the real assessment meant that someone with high-level access was actively helping her expose the corruption. "So where did the other $40 go?" Sarah asked rhetorically, opening the folder to reveal page after page of financial records. "The answer is a complex web of shell companies, inflated contracts and kickback schemes that would make an organized crime family proud." She pulled out a flowchart that traced the movement of money through various accounts and companies. Even from a distance, Richardson could see the complexity of the financial network he had created, the carefully constructed maze of transactions designed to obscure the trail of stolen funds. $23 million went to Maritime Defense Solutions, a company that was supposedly providing advanced radar systems for the fleet. Sarah explained. "The problem is that Maritime Defense Solutions was owned by your brother-in-law, Robert Henderson, and the radar systems were never delivered. The company exists only on paper, with no employees, no facilities, and no actual products." Richardson's legs nearly buckled. Robert Henderson was married to his sister, and the two men had always been close. When Richardson had approached him about creating a shell company to receive defense contracts, Henderson had been eager to help, understanding that they were both positioned to make millions of dollars with relatively little risk. The radar contract had been a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation, structured in such a way that payment was made up front with delivery scheduled far enough in the future that the theft wouldn't be discovered for years. $15 million went to Coastal Properties LLC for the purchase of what were described as strategic training facilities, Sarah continued. These facilities turned out to be luxury vacation homes in Florida, California, and Hawaii, all purchased under your wife's maiden name and used exclusively by your family for personal vacations. The vacation homes had been Richardson's pride and joy, symbols of the wealth and status that his corruption had provided. He had convinced himself that they were legitimate investments, that the military benefits of having senior officers maintain properties in strategically important locations justified the expense. But looking at them through Sarah's eyes, he could see how obviously fraudulent the purchases had been. The remaining $9 million was distributed among various accounts controlled by the other officers involved in the cover-up, Sarah said, pulling out bank statements and account records that documented every transaction. Colonel Marcus Webb received $2.3 million for his role in manipulating the intelligence reports. Captain Jennifer Torres received $1.8 million for falsifying the damage assessments. Admiral Patricia Morrison. "Wait," Richardson interrupted, his voice cracking. "Admiral Morrison was never involved in any financial irregularities. She's been helping you expose this corruption." Sarah's smile was cold and knowing. "You're absolutely right, Admiral. Admiral Morrison was never involved in the financial corruption because she was never part of the cover-up. When she discovered what you had done, when she learned how you had destroyed my career to protect your secrets, she spent 3 years gathering evidence and looking for me. The revelation hit Richardson like a physical blow. Admiral Morrison had been his mentor, the officer who had guided his career and supported his promotions. The idea that she had turned against him, that she was actively working to expose his crimes, was almost more devastating than the financial evidence itself. Morrison knew what kind of officer you were, Sarah continued. She knew about your ambition, your willingness to cut corners, your tendency to put personal advancement ahead of the welfare of your personnel, but she never imagined that you would stoop to theft and murder to protect your secrets. Murder? Richardson's voice rose to a near shout. I never killed anyone. The deaths during Operation Blackwater were the result of enemy action, not anything I did. Sarah's eyes blazed with fury. You sent my crew into a trap based on intelligence you knew was worthless. You ignored warnings from multiple sources because you were more concerned about your promotion than the lives of the sailors under your command. And when I tried to expose what you had done, you destroyed my career and tried to have me killed. Richardson's face went white. That's not true. I never... The car accident that was supposed to kill me 6 months after my discharge, Sarah interrupted. The brake lines that had been cut, the anonymous tips to the police suggesting I was suicidal, the insurance investigation that was mysteriously closed without explanation. Did you really think I wouldn't figure out who was behind it? The crowd around them gasped, the implications of Sarah's words sinking in. Attempted murder was far beyond simple corruption or cover-up. It was a capital crime that could result in life imprisonment or even execution. Richardson could see the shock and horror on the faces of the personnel surrounding him, could see smartphones being raised to capture his reaction. I don't know what you're talking about, Richardson said weakly. If you were in an accident, it was just that, an accident. Sarah pulled out a police report and several photographs that appeared to show a badly damaged vehicle. This is the crash scene from the accident that was supposed to kill me. The investigators found that the brake lines had been cut with precision tools, not damaged in the crash. The cuts were made by someone with mechanical knowledge and access to professional equipment. She pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a private investigation firm. This is the report from the private investigator I hired after I realized that the accident wasn't random. He traced the payments for the hit back through a series of shell companies and intermediaries to an account controlled by your wife. Richardson felt the world spinning around him. The attempted murder had been his most desperate gamble, a last resort effort to permanently silence the one person who could destroy him. He had hired professionals, used intermediaries and cutouts to ensure that the crime could never be traced back to him. The fact that Sarah had survived and discovered the truth was a nightmare beyond his worst fears. You can't prove any of this, Richardson said desperately. These are wild accusations from someone with a history of mental instability. No court would ever... Actually, they would, Sarah interrupted. Because I'm not the only witness anymore. She gestured toward the crowd, and Richardson noticed for the first time that several of the personnel were wearing recording equipment that appeared to be more sophisticated than simple smartphones. Professional cameras and audio equipment suggested that this confrontation was being documented by serious journalists, not just casual observers. Meet David Park, Sarah said, pointing to a middle-aged man in civilian clothes who stepped forward from the crowd. He was my operations officer during Operation Blackwater and the only other person who kept copies of the real mission reports. He's been in hiding for 3 years, afraid for his life after several attempts were made to silence him permanently. Richardson recognized Park immediately. He had been a competent officer, but one who had asked too many questions and shown too much integrity to be trusted with the cover-up. Richardson had assumed that Park's disappearance after his discharge meant that the problem had been resolved one way or another. Commander Park has spent the last 3 years working with federal investigators, Sarah continued. He's been providing evidence of the corruption and helping to build the case against everyone involved in the cover-up. And he's not the only one. She gestured again, and 2 more people stepped forward from the crowd. Richardson recognized them immediately. Senator Margaret Williams and FBI Special Agent Robert Cruz. The senator was the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, while the FBI agent was one of the Bureau's top experts on military corruption and fraud. Senator Williams has been investigating Defense Department corruption for the past 2 years, Sarah explained. Agent Cruz has been building criminal cases against the officers involved in Operation Blackwater. They've been waiting for the right moment to make their move, and that moment is now. Richardson felt his knees give out, and he had to lean against a nearby vehicle to keep from collapsing entirely. The presence of a senator and an FBI agent meant that his exposure was complete, that there was no way to spin or minimize the revelations. His career was over, his freedom forfeit, his reputation destroyed beyond redemption. "The evidence against you is overwhelming, Admiral Richardson," Agent Cruz said, stepping forward with his credentials clearly visible. Financial records, witness testimonies, communication intercepts, and physical evidence all point to a conspiracy involving theft of government funds, falsification of official reports, and attempted murder. Richardson's mind raced through his options, but he could see that there were none. The trap had been perfectly constructed, years in the making, with every possible escape route blocked. Sarah Chen had not come to the base as a desperate vagrant seeking attention. She had come as the final piece in a complex investigation that was about to bring down everyone involved in the corruption. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Cruz continued, producing a set of handcuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney, and if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." As the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, Admiral James Richardson understood that his world had changed forever. The homeless woman he had mocked and dismissed just hours earlier had proven to be his downfall, the instrument of justice that would finally bring him to account for his crimes. But even as he was led away in handcuffs, Richardson couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for Sarah Chen. She had endured 3 years of homelessness and degradation, had survived multiple attempts on her life, and had painstakingly gathered the evidence needed to expose the truth. She had proven to be exactly the kind of officer the Navy was supposed to produce, courageous, dedicated, and absolutely committed to doing the right thing regardless of the personal cost. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood before the imposing facade of the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., wearing a crisp new navy blue suit that had been donated by a veterans organization. Her hair was clean and professionally styled, her posture erect with the bearing of the decorated naval officer she had once been. The transformation from the homeless vagrant who had confronted Admiral Richardson at the naval base was remarkable, but the steely determination in her eyes remained unchanged. The media circus surrounding the trial had been unlike anything the military justice system had ever seen. Operation Blackwater had become a household name, a symbol of everything that could go wrong when ambition and corruption infected the highest levels of military leadership. News outlets around the world had covered every detail of the case, from Richardson's arrest to the discovery of additional victims and co-conspirators. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through the morning's headlines. Navy corruption trial enters final phase. Admiral Richardson faces life sentence. Hero commander seeks justice for fallen sailors. The story had captured the public imagination in a way that few military scandals ever had, perhaps because it contained all the elements of a perfect morality tale. A corrupt leader, innocent victims, a cover-up at the highest levels, and a wronged hero seeking justice against impossible odds. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, protesters and family members of the sailors who had died during Operation Blackwater. Sarah could see them gathering near the entrance, holding photographs of their lost loved ones and signs demanding justice. Patricia Martinez, the mother of Petty Officer Martinez, caught sight of Sarah and waved. The two women had become close during the months of preparation for the trial, bonding over their shared loss and determination to see the truth revealed. "Sarah," Patricia called out, making her way through the crowd. "How are you feeling about today?" Sarah smiled, but the expression was tinged with sadness. "Ready to finish what we started. Your son deserves to have the truth told about how he died." Patricia nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "He would have been so proud to know that someone like you was fighting for him. Even after everything they put you through, you never gave up." The months since Richardson's arrest had been a whirlwind of activity for Sarah. The FBI had provided her with protection and temporary housing, while the investigation expanded to encompass the full scope of the corruption. Additional arrests had followed as the web of accomplices and co-conspirators was exposed. Colonel Webb, Captain Torres, and a dozen other officers had been charged with various crimes ranging from fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. But perhaps more importantly, Sarah had been vindicated in the eyes of the military justice system. The Navy had conducted its own internal investigation, concluding that her original court-martial had been based on falsified evidence and perjured testimony. Her rank had been restored posthumously, her service record cleared, and her discharge changed from dishonorable to honorable. The back pay alone amounted to over $200,000, enough to get her life back on track. Admiral Patricia Morrison emerged from a black sedan at the curb surrounded by a small security detail. She had become one of the government's star witnesses, her testimony providing crucial insider perspective on the corruption that had infected the upper ranks of the Navy. Her decision to cooperate with the investigation had cost her friendships and created enemies within the service, but she had never wavered in her commitment to exposing the truth. "Sarah," Admiral Morrison said as she approached, extending her hand. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready for 3 years," Sarah replied, gripping the Admiral's hand firmly. "The question is whether the system is ready to hold its own accountable." Morrison's expression was grave. "The evidence is overwhelming. The financial records alone would be enough to convict Richardson of multiple felonies. Combined with your testimony and David Park's corroboration, there's no way he can escape justice." The investigation had revealed that the corruption surrounding Operation Blackwater was far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. The $47 million that had been stolen was just the tip of the iceberg, representing only the most obvious and easily traced transactions. Forensic accountants had discovered an additional $31 million in questionable expenditures spread across dozens of projects and programs, all bearing Richardson's fingerprints. The attempted murder charges had proven to be the most difficult to prosecute, requiring careful reconstruction of the events that had led to Sarah's car accident. But the private investigator she had hired had done excellent work, tracing the payments back through multiple shell companies and intermediaries to accounts controlled by Richardson's associates. The mechanic who had sabotaged her car had eventually agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing the final piece of evidence needed to prove the assassination attempt. As they entered the courthouse, Sarah was struck by the solemnity of the moment. This was more than just a criminal trial. It was a reckoning for an entire system that had allowed corruption and abuse to flourish unchecked. The outcome would send a message about whether the military justice system was capable of policing itself, whether accountability meant anything when it came to high-ranking officers. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with every seat filled and spectators lining the walls. Sarah recognized faces from throughout her ordeal: FBI agents who had worked on the case, journalists who had covered the story, family members of the victims, and military personnel who had come to witness the conclusion of one of the most significant corruption cases in naval history. Admiral Richardson sat at the defendant's table, his face gaunt and pale after months in federal custody. The man who had once commanded respect and fear through his position and authority now looked small and defeated. His legal team, among the most expensive defense attorneys in Washington, had tried every possible strategy to discredit the evidence and witnesses, but the case against him was simply too strong. Federal Judge Margaret Thompson called the court to order, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today for the sentencing of Admiral James Richardson, who has been convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, theft of government property, and attempted murder. Before I pronounce sentence, I will hear from representatives of the victims." Sarah rose from her seat and walked to the podium, her heart pounding despite months of preparation for this moment. The courtroom fell silent as she adjusted the microphone and looked directly at Richardson for the first time since his arrest. "Your Honor, my name is Sarah Chen, and I am a commander in the United States Navy," she began, her voice steady and strong. 3 years ago, I was court-martialed and discharged dishonorably because I refused to file false reports about Operation Blackwater. I lost my career, my home, my family, and very nearly my life because I believed that the truth mattered more than protecting corrupt officers. Richardson looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and resentment. Sarah held his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated or diminished by the man who had tried to destroy her. "The 6 sailors who died during Operation Blackwater were good people, Your Honor. They were sons and daughters, husbands and wives, fathers and mothers who died because their leaders sent them into a trap based on intelligence they knew was worthless. They died because Admiral Richardson was more concerned about his promotion than the safety of the men and women under his command." Sarah paused, collecting her thoughts and emotions. But their deaths might have meant something if the truth had been told about how they died, if the lessons had been learned, if the systems had been fixed, if accountability had been enforced. Instead, their sacrifice was covered up, their families lied to, and their memory dishonored by the very people who should have been protecting their legacy. She turned to address Richardson directly. "You stole $47 million from the American taxpayers, money that should have been used to protect the sailors and Marines who risk their lives every day. You falsified reports, suborned perjury, and destroyed the careers of good officers who tried to do the right thing. And when I threatened to expose your crimes, you tried to have me murdered." Richardson's defense attorney started to object, but Judge Thompson waved him silent. This was Sarah's moment, her opportunity to finally confront the man who had destroyed her life and tried to silence her forever. "I spent 3 years living on the streets, Your Honor, branded as a traitor by the system I had served faithfully for over 2 decades. I slept in shelters and doorways, ate at soup kitchens, and endured the contempt of people who saw me as nothing more than a pathetic vagrant. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the pain and humiliation seemed too much to bear." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "But every time I was tempted to quit, I remembered the faces of those 6 sailors. I remembered the promises I had made to their families, the oath I had taken to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I realized that corruption and abuse of power are enemies just as dangerous as any foreign threat, and that fighting them required the same courage and dedication that we ask of our combat troops." The courtroom was completely silent, hanging on every word. Sarah could see tears in the eyes of spectators, could feel the weight of history in the moment. "Your Honor, I'm not here today seeking revenge or personal satisfaction. I'm here seeking justice for 6 dead sailors, and accountability for a system that allowed their deaths to be covered up and their sacrifice to be dishonored. Admiral Richardson represents everything that is wrong with military leadership when ambition trumps integrity, when personal advancement becomes more important than the welfare of subordinates, when corruption is allowed to flourish in the shadows." She looked directly at Richardson again, her voice filled with quiet authority. "You had the privilege of commanding some of the finest men and women in the world. They trusted you with their lives, their careers, their futures, and you betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. You sent them into harm's way for your own personal gain, and when they died as a result of your negligence, you dishonored their memory with lies and cover-ups." Sarah stepped back from the podium, her testimony complete. Judge Thompson nodded approvingly, clearly moved by the power and eloquence of her words. "Admiral Richardson," Judge Thompson said, addressing the defendant directly, "you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of some of the most serious crimes that can be committed by a military officer. Your actions represent a betrayal of the trust placed in you by the American people and the sailors and Marines under your command." Richardson rose unsteadily, his face pale and his hands trembling. The man who had once commanded with absolute authority now looked broken and defeated. "The evidence in this case shows a pattern of corruption, abuse of power, and callous disregard for human life that is truly shocking," the judge continued. "You stole millions of dollars in taxpayer funds, falsified official reports, destroyed the career of a dedicated officer who tried to expose your crimes, and attempted to commit murder to cover up your corruption." Judge Thompson paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "The sentences I am about to impose reflect not just the seriousness of your crimes, but the need to send a clear message that no one, regardless of rank or position, is above the law." Sarah held her breath as the judge prepared to announce the sentence. This was the moment she had been working toward for 3 years, the culmination of everything she had endured and sacrificed. "On the charges of theft of government property and fraud, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. On the charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice, I sentence you to an additional 15 years. On the charge of attempted murder, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Family members of the victims embraced each other, their faces wet with tears of relief and vindication. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The burden of 3 years of struggle and suffering finally beginning to ease. As Richardson was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Sarah one final time. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and Sarah saw something she had never expected to see in his expression: a grudging respect for the woman who had brought him down. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was surrounded by reporters and well-wishers. The questions came fast and furious, but she answered them all with the same quiet dignity and strength that had sustained her through her ordeal. "Commander Chen, what's next for you?" asked a reporter from CNN. Sarah smiled, looking up at the clear blue sky above Washington, D.C. "I'm going back to the Navy, if they'll have me. There's still work to be done, reforms to be implemented, and lessons to be learned from what happened. The military needs officers who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous." Admiral Morrison stepped forward, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. The Navy would be honored to have Commander Chen back in service. In fact, I've been authorized to offer her a position on my staff, working on military justice reform and anti-corruption initiatives. Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of purpose and direction that had been missing from her life for 3 years. She had fought the longest and hardest battle of her career, and she had won. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and the memory of 6 fallen sailors had finally been honored. As she walked down the courthouse steps, surrounded by the families of the men who had died under her command, Sarah Chen knew that her real service to her country was just beginning. The homeless vagrant who had confronted Admiral Richardson at the naval base 6 months earlier was gone, replaced by an officer who had been tested by fire and proven worthy of the trust placed in her. The fight for justice was over, but the fight for reform and accountability would continue. And Sarah Chen would be at the forefront of that battle, carrying the memory of 6 fallen sailors and the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who wear the same uniform.